The pain didn't hit all at once. It started as a dull pressure low in my abdomen as I drove away from the base, the kind you try to ignore because you're tired and just want to get home. I'd been on duty for almost 16 hours. My uniform was still stiff, my head buzzing from too much coffee and not enough sleep. I told myself I could make it the last 10 minutes. I was wrong. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I sat there for a second, breathing through my nose, counting like they teach you. In for 4, out for 4. That's when the nausea hit sharp and sudden, followed by a wave of heat that made my vision blur. I didn't even bother going inside. I leaned against the car and called 911. The paramedics were calm in that way that tells you this isn't their first bad day. They asked questions. I answered the ones I could. When they loaded me into the ambulance, one of them pressed gently on my stomach and stopped immediately. "That hurt?" he asked. "Yes," I said a little too fast. "Okay," he said, already reaching for his radio. As the siren started up, my thoughts snapped into one clear line. Lily and Lucas. My twins were at home with our regular sitter. She was reliable, but she had a hard cutoff time. She was supposed to leave at 8. I checked the clock on the wall of the ambulance. It was 7:18. I grabbed my phone. The ER doors flew open less than 10 minutes later. Bright lights, fast voices. Someone saying possible internal bleeding. Someone else saying we need imaging now. A nurse took my phone and put it in my hand again when I asked. "Just don't drop it," she said. I pulled up my sister's number. Vanessa lived 20 minutes away. She worked flexible hours, no kids, plenty of opinions about how I raised mine. If anyone could step in for a few hours, it was her. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. She answered on the 4th ring. "What's wrong?" she said, already irritated. "I'm at the hospital," I said. "I was just brought in by ambulance. They think it's serious. I need surgery." There was a pause, the kind where you know someone is rolling their eyes. "Okay," and she said. "I need you to go to my house," I said. "The sitter leaves at 8. I just need someone there until I figure out what's happening." Another pause, voices in the background, music, laughter. "Evelyn, you're probably overreacting," she said. "You always do this." "I'm not," I said. "I'm in a gurney. They're running tests right now." She sighed. "I have plans. I'm not asking you to cancel your life," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just go sit in my living room for a few hours." She didn't answer. I heard typing. Then my phone buzzed. A text message. "Vanessa, I'm not doing this. You always make everything dramatic. Call someone else." I stared at the screen, waiting for the words to change. They didn't. "Vanessa," I said into the phone, "I'm bleeding." "That's what you say every time something doesn't go your way," she replied. "I'm busy." Then the line went dead. The nurse was back, adjusting something near my IV. "We need to take you for a scan," she said. "Can I have a second?" I asked. She nodded, but her face told me that second was already borrowed. I took a screenshot of the text. Not because I was angry, not because I had some plan. I did it because something in me went very quiet, very clear, and I knew I'd need to remember exactly how this moment felt. I called an emergency childcare service I'd bookmarked months ago and never thought I'd use. I explained the situation in short professional sentences. "Yes, twins." "Yes, immediately." "Yes, I'd pay whatever the rate was." I sent them the address, the sitter's number, the alarm code. It was handled in 4 minutes. 4 minutes strangers needed to do what my own sister refused. As they wheeled me down the hall, I checked the time again, 7:41. I texted the sitter to let her know someone was coming. She replied with a thumbs up and a heart. That almost broke me more than the pain. The doctor stopped at the foot of the gurney. "We see internal bleeding," he said. "We're prepping you for surgery." "Okay," I said. "Any family on the way?" I thought about lying. I didn't. "No," I said. "Just my kids." He nodded once. "We'll take good care of you." They pushed me through double doors. The ceiling lights passed overhead in a steady rhythm. I focused on my breathing the way I'd been trained. Control what you can. Don't waste energy on what you can't. Right before they transferred me to the operating table, I checked my phone one last time. No missed calls, no follow-up texts, nothing. If this part of the story is already making you feel something, take a second and drop a comment. You don't have to explain anything. Just let me know you're here. And if you want to hear how this unfolded, subscribing helps more than you think. The anesthesia hit fast. My last thought before everything went dark wasn't fear. It was clarity. I wasn't confused about where I stood anymore. When I woke up hours later, my mouth was dry and my body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. A nurse noticed my eyes open and came over. "Surgery went well," she said. "You're going to be okay." "Thank you," I said, my voice rough. "Your kids are safe," she added. The emergency sitter checked in. "They're sleeping." Relief washed through me so hard I had to close my eyes. "Did anyone call?" I asked. She checked the chart. No family listed. I nodded. That made sense. Later that night, when the ward was quiet and the machines were humming softly around me, I unlocked my phone and opened my banking app. The screen glowed in the dark. Rows of scheduled transfers stared back at me. Monthly. Automatic. Unquestioned. I didn't touch anything yet. I just looked. My hand rested on my abdomen, sore but steady. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel torn between being a good daughter, a good sister, or a good officer. I felt awake. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm plastic, and the monitor beside my bed kept time with a slow, steady beep that made it impossible to pretend I was anywhere else. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my body heavy, my mind uncomfortably sharp. Sleep wouldn't come back. Every time I closed my eyes, Vanessa's words replayed flat and dismissive, like she'd been reading off a grocery list instead of responding to a medical emergency. I turned my head toward the window. It was still dark outside. Somewhere Lily and Lucas were sleeping in their own beds, tucked in by a stranger who'd shown up because my sister wouldn't. That thought didn't hurt the way I expected. It felt clarifying. Growing up, clarity had never been encouraged in our house. In our family, everything ran on an unspoken hierarchy. Nobody ever sat us down and explained it, but you learned fast if you were paying attention. Vanessa was 3 years older than me, and from the start, she was the one people revolved around. She was loud where I was quiet, dramatic where I was reserved, and she had a way of filling a room that made adults lean in instead of pull back. At school events, teachers remembered her name. At family gatherings, relatives asked about her plans, her goals, her opinions. When she talked, people listened. When I talked, they nodded. My parents loved to describe us with neat little labels. Vanessa was passionate. I was practical. Vanessa was sensitive. I was strong. Those words sounded harmless, even complimentary, until you realized how they were used. Passionate people needed support. Sensitive people needed understanding. Strong people didn't need anything at all. When Vanessa decided she wanted to try competitive dance, my parents rearranged their schedules. When she quit 2 years later, they told her how brave she was for knowing when to walk away. When she switched majors twice in college, it was framed as self-discovery. When I decided I wanted to join the military, my dad nodded once and said, "That makes sense. You've always been good with structure." That was it. No argument, no concern, no questions about why I wanted to leave or what I might be trying to escape. Just an assumption that I could handle it. And I did. That became my role. The one who handled things. If Vanessa forgot something, someone covered for her. If she missed a deadline, there was always an explanation ready. If she was stressed, the entire household adjusted. When I struggled, I learned not to mention it. Complaining felt unnecessary, almost embarrassing. Why make noise when everyone already expected you to be fine? By high school, I understood the rules well enough to stop testing them. I got good grades, stayed out of trouble, and learned how to make myself useful without asking for attention. I helped where I could. I stayed quiet where I couldn't. That earned me praise of a different kind. "You're so reliable," my mom would say. "We never worry about you," my dad liked to add. They meant it as reassurance. What it taught me was that worry was reserved for people who mattered more. Vanessa, meanwhile, had a talent for turning minor inconveniences into full-blown emergencies. A bad grade, a fight with a friend, a breakup that lasted all of 3 weeks. Each time the family rallied around her like the house might collapse if they didn't. I watched it happen over and over, not with jealousy at first, but with curiosity. It was like observing a system in motion. Predictable, efficient, unfair. I didn't resent her for it back then. That came later. At the time, I just adapted. When I left for training, Vanessa cried at the airport. My mother hugged her longer than she hugged me. "She's just worried," Mom explained afterward, as if I'd asked. I hadn't. Letters came from home while I was in basic. Vanessa wrote about how hard it was with me gone, how empty the house felt without my help. My parents wrote about her new plans, her new ideas, her new stressors. My name appeared occasionally, usually at the end of a paragraph, like a footnote. "We're proud of you. Stay safe." That was enough. I told myself it was enough. The years passed and the dynamic didn't change. It just grew more expensive. Vanessa graduated, moved back home, moved out again, moved back again. There was always something she needed help with. A bill, a gap between jobs, a rough patch. My parents never asked her to solve those problems alone. They turned to me instead, gently at first, then with increasing confidence. "You don't mind helping, right? You're in a better position than she is. She just needs a little more time." And because I was capable, because I had a steady paycheck, because I'd been trained not to flinch at responsibility, I said yes, not dramatically, not resentfully, just automatically. By the time I realized how deeply this pattern was set, it didn't feel like something I could question without sounding selfish, so I didn't. I just adjusted my life around it the way I always had. Lying in that hospital bed, listening to the machines, and feeling the dull ache where surgeons had done their work. I replayed those moments with a level of distance I'd never had before. Not with anger, with assessment. Vanessa hadn't changed, neither had my parents. The system was still working exactly as designed. The difference was that, for the first time, I wasn't inside it. A nurse came in quietly to check my vitals. Her movements practiced and efficient. "You doing okay?" she asked. I said, surprised to realize it was true. She smiled and moved on, leaving the room dim and still again. I reached for my phone not to call anyone, but to scroll through old photos, birthday parties, family dinners, holiday gatherings where Vanessa stood front and center laughing, gesturing, holding court, while I hovered just off to the side, camera in hand. I didn't look upset in any of them. I looked dependable. That night, staring at those images, I understood something I hadn't before. Being dependable hadn't protected me. It had made me invisible. And invisibility, I was learning, came at a cost. The first thing I did the next morning was sit up too fast and immediately regret it. Pain shot through my side, sharp enough to force a breath out of me that sounded like a laugh and a groan at the same time. I waited for it to settle, one hand braced against the bed rail, the other flat on the mattress, like I was grounding myself. This body had carried me through worse than this. I reminded myself of that. A corpsman came in a few minutes later with my meds and a clipboard. He spoke clearly, looked me in the eye, and explained exactly what he was doing before he did it. No rushing, no assumptions. When he left, he said, "If you need anything, hit the call button. Don't try to be tough about it." That line stuck with me longer than it should have. I hadn't always known I would join the Navy. It wasn't some childhood dream or family tradition. It was a decision I made the same way I made most of my decisions back then, quietly, logically, and without asking for permission. I was 22 when it finally clicked that staying in my parents' orbit meant I would always be the backup plan. The one who filled gaps. The one who smoothed things over. The one whose life could be rearranged without notice because everyone assumed I'd adjust. I didn't want that to be my whole story. The recruiter didn't sugarcoat anything. Long hours, strict rules, no guarantees. I appreciated that. He laid everything out in plain language and then asked, "Can you handle that?" It wasn't a challenge. It was a question. "Yes," I said. And for the first time, that answer felt like it belonged to me. Boot camp was exactly what everyone says. It is exhausting, uncomfortable, and relentless. You're stripped down to basics fast. No titles, no excuses, no room for dramatics. Either you show up and do the work, or you don't. There's something brutally honest about that environment. I thrived in it, not because it was easy, but because the expectations were clear. When you followed orders, you were acknowledged. When you performed well, it was noted. When you messed up, you were corrected directly, not talked around. Nobody expected you to read minds or guess where you stood. For someone who'd grown up navigating invisible rules, that clarity felt like oxygen. As I advanced, the respect became more tangible. It wasn't warm or sentimental, but it was solid. My evaluations were based on performance, not personality. My voice mattered in meetings because I'd earned my place there. When I said I could handle something, people believed me, and if I said I couldn't, they listened. That last part was new. I carried that mindset with me into every assignment. Do your job, take care of your people. Don't make promises you can't keep. The Navy didn't care if I was dramatic or quiet or convenient. It cared if I was competent. Somewhere along the way, that rewired how I saw myself. When I got pregnant, it complicated things, but it didn't undo them. I adjusted my plans. I followed protocols. I communicated clearly with my command. Nobody told me I was overreacting. Nobody implied I was being difficult. They asked what I needed and worked within policy to make it happen. I remember sitting in my CO's office, explaining my situation in the most straightforward way possible, braced for pushback out of habit. Instead, he nodded and said, "We'll make a plan. You're not the first and you won't be the last." That was it. No drama, no judgment. I didn't realize how stark that contrast was until I compared it to home. Every visit back reminded me how different the rules were there. Vanessa still took up all the oxygen in the room. My parents still deferred to her moods. The family dynamic hadn't evolved just because I had. At one dinner, Vanessa complained loudly about how stressed she was between jobs, how unfair the market was, how exhausting it all felt. My mom listened sympathetic, asking questions, offering solutions. When the conversation turned to me, my dad said, "And Evelyn's doing fine as always." I hadn't said anything yet. That word "fine" followed me everywhere. It was shorthand for invisible. It meant no one needed to look closer. I learned to compartmentalize. The Navy got my focus and my honesty. Home got the edited version. It wasn't lying exactly. It was strategic omission. That strategy served me well for a long time. The problem with compartmentalization is that it works right up until it doesn't. When something breaks through the walls you've built, it tends to do real damage. Back in the hospital, a different doctor came in to explain my recovery timeline. He talked me through limitations, follow-up appointments, and signs to watch for. I asked practical questions. He answered them. There was mutual respect in the exchange, quiet but present. As he left, he said, "You handled this well. Not everyone does." I thought about that after he was gone. Handling things well had always been my specialty. The military had refined it, sharpened it, given it structure. But it had also taught me something else I hadn't fully applied yet. Boundaries aren't a weakness. They're a requirement. On base, boundaries were enforced. Rank mattered. Roles mattered. You didn't blur lines just because someone expected you to. You followed protocol for a reason. At home, there had never been protocol, just expectations. Endless unspoken expectations. I looked down at my phone again, not at photos this time, but at my calendar. Shifts, appointments, training blocks. Everything was planned, accounted for, intentional. My family's demands didn't fit anywhere on that screen anymore. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me calm. I rested my head back against the pillow and closed my eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of the monitor. The Navy had taught me how to lead, how to endure, how to be clear under pressure. It hadn't taught me how to say no to my family, but it had given me all the tools I needed to learn. I unlocked my phone again and opened my banking app, the blue glow lighting up the hospital room in a way that felt almost intrusive. The numbers loaded slowly, then settled into their familiar rows. Checking, savings, scheduled payments. Everything looked exactly the way it always did. Clean, organized, predictable. I scrolled down to the section I usually avoided. Automatic transfers. There they were lined up like clockwork. One on the 1st of every month. Another on the 15th. Different amounts, different descriptions, all going to accounts I knew by heart. Mortgage, insurance, emergency. A few labeled with nothing more specific than family. I didn't start sending money because I wanted leverage. I started because it seemed practical. The first time my parents asked it was framed as temporary. Dad had called late one evening, his voice tight in that way that suggested he hated asking. The mortgage was due. Something with his retirement account hadn't transferred yet. It would just be for 1 month. I sent the money that night. The second time, it was insurance. His company had changed plans. There was a gap. They needed help covering premiums. Again, just until things settled. I sent that too. By the third time, it didn't feel like a favor anymore. It felt like maintenance, a necessary adjustment to keep everything running smoothly, no drama, no speeches, just problem solving. Vanessa knew about it, at least in theory. She'd make comments here and there, usually half joking. "Good thing you're the responsible one," she'd say. "I don't know what Mom and Dad would do without you." She never said thank you, neither did my parents. Gratitude wasn't part of the exchange. It was implied, I guess, or maybe it was assumed I didn't need it. Over time, the requests got more casual, less explanation, more expectation. The water heater broke. The car needed repairs. There was a shortfall this month. Could you just cover it? I always did. Not because anyone forced me to, but because I could. That distinction mattered to me. It made the arrangement feel voluntary, even as it grew heavier. When Lily and Lucas were born, things tightened. Diapers weren't cheap. Neither was childcare. I adjusted my budget cut back where I could and kept the transfers going. Some months were closer than I liked to admit. There were nights I stared at my own account balance longer than I should have, calculating down to the dollar. Vanessa never noticed. She had her own rhythm, new plans, new stresses, always something that justified why she couldn't contribute. She talked about finding her footing, the way some people talk about the weather, like it was an external condition no one could control. My parents backed her up without question. "She just needs time. You're in a better position. You know how she is." I did know how she was. I also knew how I was expected to be. The spreadsheet started as a practical tool. Nothing emotional, just a way to track outgoing funds so I didn't lose control of my own finances. Dates, amounts, notes. I told myself it was temporary, a way to stay organized. It didn't feel real until I scrolled far enough down to see how long it had been going on. Years, not 1 or 2. Not a rough patch. Years of consistent support that had quietly become part of my family's operating budget. Support they planned around, counted on, built assumptions on. I did the math one afternoon out of curiosity more than anything else. I wish I hadn't. Seeing the total made my stomach drop. Not because I couldn't afford it, but because of what it represented. Deferred plans, compromises I hadn't even labeled as such, choices I'd made automatically without discussion. And still, there had never been a conversation about it. No one sat me down and said, "We appreciate what you're doing." No one asked how it affected me. No one checked in to see if it was still okay. The support flowed one way, silence flowed the other. Back in the hospital room, I tapped on one of the scheduled payments and read the details slowly. The date was coming up soon. Muscle memory kicked in, the instinct to make sure everything was set correctly. I caught myself mid-thought and stopped. This wasn't about anger. That surprised me. If anything, I felt detached, like I was reviewing someone else's account. The numbers didn't accuse or defend. They just existed. A nurse came in to adjust my IV. "You okay?" she asked, glancing at my face. "Yeah," I said. "Just doing math." She smiled. "That'll do it." After she left, I kept scrolling. I noticed patterns I'd never paid attention to before. Increase that coincided with Vanessa's setbacks. Extra transfers after her breakups. A spike around the time she moved apartments. Each one explained away at the time as a coincidence, or generosity, or family helping family. What it really was, I was starting to see, was enablement. Not malicious, not planned. Just steady, unchecked dependence. I thought about all the times Vanessa had called me dramatic or too intense when I raised even mild concerns. How quickly she dismissed my stress as overthinking. How easily she assumed I'd adapt. She hadn't known how much I was covering. Not exactly, but she hadn't asked either. Asking would have required acknowledging that someone else was carrying weight she didn't want to see. My phone buzzed softly. with a notification from the emergency childcare service. A photo of Lily and Lucas asleep, blankets kicked off, hair sticking up at odd angles. I smiled despite myself. They were safe. That mattered. Everything else could wait. I locked the screen and set the phone down, resting my hand against my side. The pain was manageable now, a reminder rather than a threat. My mind, on the other hand, was busy reorganizing itself. I'd spent years treating financial support like a neutral act stripped of emotion. A transaction, a responsibility, something that kept the peace. But peace that required one person to constantly give while others took wasn't peace. It was imbalance, and imbalance, I'd learned in the military, eventually caused failure. I didn't make any changes that night. I didn't cancel anything or move money around. I just sat there with the information, letting it settle into place alongside everything else that had become clear since the ambulance ride. For the first time, the question wasn't whether my family needed my help. It was whether this arrangement made any sense at all. That thought stayed with me long after the room went quiet again, steady and unignorable. Like the monitor's slow, consistent beat-marking time, I could no longer afford to waste. The nurse came back to dim the lights, and I didn't stop her. The room settled into a low hum, machines breathing for me, while my own body tried to remember how to rest. I shifted carefully, testing what hurt and what didn't, and my phone slid a little on the blanket. The screen lit up with a calendar reminder I hadn't cleared yet. A date circled in blue, a note attached to it that read, "Family Dinner." I laughed quietly, and then stopped when my side protested. That reminder wasn't new. It had been sitting there for weeks, untouched, like a habit I hadn't bothered to break yet. Family dinners had always followed the same pattern. Vanessa arrived late, talked loud, and dominated the table with whatever crisis or plan she was currently nursing. My parents listened, asked questions, offered advice. I filled glasses, passed dishes, and answered when spoken to. If I mentioned work, it was acknowledged politely and then steered back to Vanessa's life. That rhythm had been in place long before I had kids. The first time I realized how deep it went was when I was pregnant. Vanessa had known before anyone else. She'd looked at me with something like surprise when I told her, like she hadn't considered that I might have a life that existed outside my utility. She'd hugged me then, immediately launched into a story about how stressful her job search was, and how unfair the timing felt. My parents' reaction was quieter, concerned but distant. They asked practical questions. They didn't ask how I felt. When complications came up later in the pregnancy, I didn't tell them right away. That wasn't intentional. It just didn't occur to me to loop them in. I handled appointments, followed instructions, adjusted my schedule, and moved on. It wasn't until I ended up in the hospital overnight for monitoring that I called. My mom sounded distracted. My dad said they'd check their calendar. Vanessa texted the next day to ask if everything was resolved. No one came. I told myself it made sense. Long drive, busy schedules, nothing they could really do. I'd made a career out of explaining away absences like that. When Lily and Lucas were born, things got quieter instead of louder. No dramatic entrance at the hospital. No one fighting for time in the waiting room. My parents visited briefly, held each baby once, took photos, and left early because Vanessa had a work thing that evening. She really needed us, Mom said, like it was a statement of fact, not a choice. Those first weeks were a blur of feedings, exhaustion, and a kind of loneliness I hadn't expected. Friends dropped off meals. Coworkers checked in. My command sent flowers. My family sent texts. Let us know if you need anything. I didn't answer. I was too tired to explain what anything actually looked like. As the twins grew, the pattern didn't change. Vanessa showed up when it suited her. Holidays, photos, occasional gifts. She loved being called Aunt Vanessa. In public, loved the way it sounded when she said it herself. She never offered to help. She never asked what our days looked like. She assumed I had it handled. And I did. That was the problem. Every time something hard came up, my family reacted the same way. A pause, a polite acknowledgement, a redirection back to Vanessa's needs. When I got deployed for a short assignment and had to juggle childcare logistics, I didn't even consider asking them. I arranged coverage, cleared it with my command, and moved on. That level of self-sufficiency had become automatic. So when the pain started on my drive home from base, when the night spiraled into ambulances and hospital lights, part of me already knew how that call to Vanessa would go. I just hadn't expected it to be so blunt. Lying there now, replaying the years that led up to that moment, it was hard to pretend this was an isolated failure. This wasn't my family having a bad night. This was my family being consistent. They hadn't failed me because they were overwhelmed. They'd failed me because they didn't see my emergencies as real emergencies, not compared to Vanessa's inconveniences. The difference this time was that the cost wasn't abstract. It wasn't a missed visit or an awkward silence. It was two small kids who needed an adult and a sister who decided her plans mattered more. My phone buzzed again, softer this time. Another update from the sitter service. A note confirming the overnight arrangement had been extended, no issues. Kids doing fine. I exhaled slowly. That was the second abandonment, if I was being honest with myself. The first had taught me to cope. This one taught me to stop excusing. I'd spent years assuming my family would show up when it really counted, even if they were unreliable in smaller ways. I told myself there was a line they wouldn't cross. Vanessa crossed it without hesitation, and my parents, by extension, let her. I thought about calling them then from the hospital bed, laying everything out in one clean, controlled conversation. The words formed easily in my head. Clear, direct, almost rehearsed. I didn't pick up the phone. There was a time when I would have. When I would have tried to fix this before it became a problem, smoothing it over the way I always did. That instinct stirred briefly and then passed. Fixing things only worked when both sides acknowledged something was broken. The monitor beeped steadily beside me. The room felt smaller now, not claustrophobic, just contained. Manageable. I could work within this space. I adjusted the blanket and closed my eyes again, not to sleep, but to think without distractions. Vanessa's voice echoed once more in my head, not angry, just dismissive. I'm busy, as if that explained everything. Busy had always been enough before. It wasn't enough anymore. That realization didn't come with a rush of emotion or a dramatic shift. It settled in quietly, like a weight being set down after carrying it for too long. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel guilty. I felt resolved. Somewhere between the hum of the machines and the slow ache of recovery, I stopped wondering whether my family would step up if I asked again. I already had my answer. I waited until the ward went quiet again. Not the kind of quiet that means everyone's asleep, but the kind where the interruptions finally stop and you're left alone with your thoughts. The lights were dimmed. The hallway sounds faded into a distant shuffle. My body ached in a dull, manageable way, like it was reminding me to stay still. I reached for my phone and unlocked it without hesitation. The banking app opened where I'd left it earlier, the screen already familiar. I didn't scroll this time. I tapped directly into scheduled payments. The list populated instantly. Dates, amounts, recipients. Everything lined up neatly the way it always had. I selected the first transfer. Mortgage payment, monthly, automatic. I stared at it for a second longer than necessary, then hit cancel. The app asked me to confirm. I did. The next one was insurance. Same process. Cancel. Confirm. Then the miscellaneous ones, smaller amounts, irregular descriptions, all of them tied to some version of just this once. I canceled each one without rushing, reading the details carefully before I did. It felt important to be precise. This wasn't an emotional reaction. It was a correction. By the time I finished, my hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. If anything, my breathing slowed. I locked the phone and set it down. That was the easy part. The harder decision sat quietly beside it, waiting. I opened my contacts and scrolled to the section labeled Emergency. 2 names were listed there, both of them familiar, both of them wrong. I'd added them years ago, out of habit, not thought. That's what you do, right? You list family. You assume proximity equals reliability. I tapped Edit. Removing a name took less than a second. The app didn't ask why. It didn't question my judgment. It just did what I told it to do. I added a new contact. A lieutenant I trusted. Someone who'd shown up consistently without drama or conditions. I added a second just in case. When I finished, the list looked different. Smaller, more accurate. I set the phone down again and rested my hand against my side, feeling the slow rise and fall of my breath. There was no rush of triumph, no dramatic sense of finality, just alignment. Things matching reality instead of expectations. A nurse came in not long after to check my vitals. She smiled when she saw I was awake. "You're doing well," she said, making a note on her tablet. "Pain manageable." "Yeah," I said. "It is." She adjusted the IV and glanced at my phone. "You've been busy." I smiled faintly. "Just reorganizing." She nodded like that made perfect sense. Maybe it did. After she left, I sat there listening to the quiet and let myself think through the consequences without flinching. The canceled transfers would be noticed. Not immediately, but soon enough. Questions would come. Confusion, maybe anger. I didn't rehearse any explanations. I didn't owe one. The truth was simple. I'd been supporting people who didn't show up when it mattered. That wasn't sustainable. It wasn't healthy. It wasn't my responsibility anymore. I thought about Vanessa finding out. The realization would hit her in stages. First confusion, then irritation. Then the assumption that it was a mistake. She'd probably call me voice-sharp with disbelief. I didn't imagine the conversation. I imagined the silence instead. That felt more honest. Later that morning, the doctor came by to check in. He asked about pain levels, mobility, discharge planning. I answered concisely. He listened. "You'll need help at home for a bit," he said. "Not a lot, but some." "I've got it covered," I said. He studied my face for a second, then nodded. "Good." That was it. No follow-up questions. No doubt. After he left, my phone buzzed. A text from the childcare service confirming arrangements through the next day. Another message from a coworker offering to drop off groceries. Practical support, clear communication, no guilt attached. I replied with a quick thank you and put the phone away. The absence of messages from my family felt louder than it should have. Not because I expected them to reach out, but because a part of me had always braced for the fallout. The tension, the confrontation, nothing came. That quiet was instructive. I spent the afternoon alternating between resting and sitting up slowly, testing my limits. Each small movement was deliberate, controlled. I'd learned to respect that process in the military. Push too hard too fast and you pay for it later. Boundaries worked the same way. That evening, I pulled up my email and drafted a short note to my command outlining my recovery timeline and confirming coverage. I kept it factual, professional. They replied within the hour, supportive and direct. "Take the time you need. We've got it." I closed my eyes and let that settle. The contrast wasn't lost on me. Before sleep took over, I checked my phone one last time. Still nothing from Vanessa. No missed calls, no half-hearted "how are you" text. I felt a brief flicker of something that might have been disappointment, and then it passed. I wasn't waiting anymore. The next day, a hospital social worker stopped by to go over discharge planning. She asked if I had family support. "I have support," I said. She nodded and moved on. That word choice mattered. As the hours passed, I noticed a subtle shift in my body. Not physical healing, though that was happening too, but a release of tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. The kind that settles into your shoulders when you're always anticipating someone else's needs. That weight wasn't gone completely, but it had shifted, off-center, manageable. I didn't make any announcements. I didn't send any messages drawing lines in the sand. I didn't need to. The decisions had already been made. And for the first time since the ambulance ride, I wasn't bracing for impact. I was steady. I was halfway through signing discharge paperwork when there was a soft knock on the door. Not the brisk tap of a nurse or the hurried entry of a doctor. This one came with a pause, like the person on the other side was giving me space before stepping in. I looked up just as the door opened. My grandfather stood there, one hand on the frame coat, still on eyes scanning the room before they settled on me. "Hey," he said quietly. It took me a second to process it. I hadn't seen him in almost 3 years. Not because we were estranged, but because distance and family logistics had always made visits complicated. That was the word my parents liked to use. "Grandpa," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. He crossed the room in a few slow steps and pulled a chair close to the bed, careful not to crowd me. He didn't hug me right away. He just looked at me, really looked like he was taking inventory. "You look tired," he said. I replied, "but I'm okay." He nodded, accepting that without question. That alone told me this conversation would be different. "I heard you were in surgery," he said. "I didn't hear it from your parents." That tracked. "Aunt Karen called me," he continued. She mentioned it in passing like it was already handled. My jaw tightened slightly, but I didn't comment. He leaned back in the chair, folding his hands loosely in his lap. I asked a few questions. I waited. I didn't get many answers, he said, so I kept asking. That was him in a sentence. He'd spent his career doing exactly that, long before he retired. He wasn't loud. He wasn't dramatic. He just didn't stop when things didn't add up. "How did you know to come?" I asked. He shrugged. "Your aunt told me Vanessa couldn't help because she was busy." That didn't sit right. Of course it didn't. I didn't want to assume anything he said, so I asked to see you myself. I shifted carefully, wincing as my side protested. He noticed immediately. "Don't move," he said, a hint of command in his voice that made me smile despite myself. "I'm fine," I said. "They're discharging me later today." "That's good," he replied. Then after a beat, "Are the kids okay?" "Yes," I said. "They're taken care of." "By who?" I told him. The sitter service, the overnight arrangement, the way it had all come together in minutes once I made the call. He listened without interrupting, his expression neutral but focused. When I finished, he didn't comment on Vanessa or my parents right away. "How long has this been going on?" he asked instead. I knew what he meant. I reached for my phone and unlocked it, pulling up the spreadsheet I'd stopped pretending was temporary. I handed him the device without ceremony. He adjusted his glasses and scrolled slowly, reading every line. Dates, amounts, notes. He didn't rush. He didn't react. He just absorbed it. When he finished, he handed the phone back to me and sat quietly for a moment. "This isn't new," he said finally. "No," I agreed. "You've been carrying this family for a long time," he said, not accusing, just stating a fact. I didn't argue. There was no point. I had my suspicions, he continued. I noticed things over the years. Who talked the most? Who got defended? Who didn't need to explain themselves? He paused. I also noticed who always said they were fine. That landed. "I never pushed," he said. "That was my mistake." I studied his face, the lines around his eyes, deeper than I remembered, the posture still straight, even seated. "You didn't do this," I said. He shook his head. I didn't stop it either. The room was quiet for a few seconds. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. "I don't want to cause a scene," I said eventually. "I'm not trying to embarrass anyone." He looked at me sharply, then not angry but intent. "I know," he said. "That's why this has gone on as long as it has." I exhaled slowly. "I'm not asking you to fix it," I added. "I've already made my decisions." "I know," he said again. "I'm not here to fix anything." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope, setting it on the bedside table between us. Cream-colored, heavy stock. My name handwritten on the front. "I'm hosting a family gathering next weekend," he said. "Everyone will be there." I glanced at the envelope but didn't touch it. "I don't know if I'm up for that," I said. "You don't have to speak," he replied. "You don't have to explain. You don't have to confront anyone. What are you asking me to do?" Then I asked. "Show up," he said simply. I raised an eyebrow. "There are things your family believes," he continued. "Stories they tell themselves. Stories they've been telling others." I intend to correct the record. I felt a flicker of unease, not fear exactly, but awareness. "And how do you plan to do that?" "By telling the truth," he said. The whole truth, calmly, with facts. I thought about Vanessa's voice on the phone. The text message. The assumption that I would always adjust. "I don't want this turned into a spectacle." "Oh," I said. He nodded. "Neither do I." There was something steady in the way he said it, like a judge assuring a courtroom he had no interest in theatrics. "I've spent my life watching people avoid responsibility by controlling the narrative," he said. "That only works when no one challenges it." I looked at the envelope again, then back at him. "You're sure?" "Yes." "And you're okay with whatever happens after?" I asked. His mouth curved slightly. "I'm retired. I don't answer to many people anymore. I laughed under my breath, careful not to move too much. He stood slowly adjusting his coat. "Think about it," he said. "You don't owe me an answer today." He paused at the door hand on the handle. "One more thing." I looked up. "Are you sure you're done carrying this?" he asked. The question wasn't loaded. It wasn't a test. It was an offer. I thought about the canceled transfers, the updated emergency contacts, the quiet that followed. "Yes," I said. "I am." He nodded once, satisfied, and left the room as quietly as he'd entered. I sat there for a long moment afterward, staring at the envelope, feeling the weight of it without touching it. Outside the window, the afternoon light had shifted softer now, less harsh than earlier. For the first time since I'd woken up from surgery, the path forward didn't feel like something I had to carve out alone. It felt like something that was already taking shape. The envelope sat unopened on my kitchen counter for 2 days, shifting slightly every time I walked past it, like it wanted attention. I didn't avoid it on purpose. I just wasn't in a hurry. After years of reacting to everyone else's urgency, moving at my own pace felt deliberate. Recovery at home was slower than I liked, but manageable. I followed instructions, took the meds, didn't lift anything heavier than I should. The twins adapted faster than I expected. Kids are good at that. They accepted the new sitter rotation, the quieter afternoons, the fact that Mom moved a little more carefully. They didn't ask questions I couldn't answer. Vanessa did. Her call came on the 3rd morning, right as I was easing myself into a chair at the kitchen table. The phone buzzed her name, lighting up the screen, like nothing had changed. I let it ring until it stopped. A minute later, a text came through. "Why did Mom say your payments didn't go through?" No greeting, no concern. Straight to the disruption. I didn't reply. The next message arrived faster. "Did you mess something up?" I set the phone face down and finished my coffee. By the afternoon, the messages multiplied. Not just from Vanessa, from my parents too. Missed calls, voicemails, a group text asking if everything was okay. The tone was polite, almost casual, like they were troubleshooting a technical glitch instead of confronting a decision. I didn't respond to any of it. That silence didn't stop the narrative from forming. It just meant I wasn't controlling it. By the end of the week, I started hearing it from other directions. A cousin I barely spoke to texted to check in. An aunt asked if I was doing better emotionally. Someone else mentioned they'd heard the surgery had been a scare, but that I was back to normal now. Back to normal. That phrase again. Vanessa, it turned out, had been busy. She framed it carefully, I'll give her that. She didn't outright lie. She just curated the version of events that made the most sense for her. According to her, I'd panicked during a routine medical situation. I'd pushed people away. I'd made rash decisions because I was overwhelmed with work and motherhood. She told one relative that I was burnt out. Another that I was taking things too personally. To my parents, she suggested I might need space for my own good. None of it sounded cruel on the surface. That was the point. What she didn't mention was the phone call, the text, the refusal. She certainly didn't mention that she'd been asked to sit with her niece and nephew for a few hours and said no. From her perspective, this wasn't manipulation. It was management. I knew that tone. I'd grown up with it. The gentle concern that redirected blame. The way facts blurred just enough to protect the person speaking. Vanessa had always been good at that. She'd learned early that if you controlled how people felt about a situation, you didn't have to deal with the details. I watched it unfold with a strange sense of distance. It was unsettling, but it wasn't shocking. It was familiar. What surprised me was how little it pulled at me. A few years ago, this would have sent me into damage control mode. I would have called relatives one by one, clarified misunderstandings, reassured everyone that I wasn't unstable or ungrateful or dramatic. I would have smoothed the edges until the story felt safe again. This time I didn't. Instead, I focused on what was directly in front of me, getting stronger, getting back into a routine, keeping life steady for my kids. The rest was noise. The envelope stayed on the counter, untouched but present. Vanessa escalated when silence didn't work. She showed up unannounced on a Saturday afternoon, knocking harder than necessary. I didn't answer the door. She texted instead. "I'm outside. We need to talk." I didn't reply to that either. A minute later, my phone rang again, then again. Then a voicemail. "Evelyn, this is getting ridiculous," she said, irritation barely masked by forced concern. "Everyone's worried about you. You can't just shut people out like this. That's not healthy." I deleted it without listening to the rest. Her concern wasn't about my health. It was about her comfort, about the disruption she couldn't spin away if I stayed quiet. Later that evening, my grandfather called. "I wanted to give you a heads up," he said. "There's some chatter." "I figured," I replied. "She's been talking," he continued. "Carefully." "I know." He paused. "You okay with that?" "Yes," I said. "I don't need to correct her." There was a beat of silence, then a low chuckle. "That's new." "I'm learning," I said. He didn't push further. "The invitation still stands." "I know." After we hung up, I finally picked up the envelope. It was heavier than it looked, the paper thick under my fingers. I didn't open it yet. I just moved it from the counter to my bag, where it could come with me when I left the house. Vanessa's version of events continued to spread in subtle ways. Nothing dramatic enough to challenge directly, just enough to plant doubt. She'd always relied on that approach. Make herself the reasonable one, frame others as unpredictable. It might have worked if there weren't facts waiting quietly in the background. That was the difference now. I wasn't relying on memory or emotion. I wasn't trying to convince anyone of how I felt. There were records, dates, messages, numbers, things that didn't shift depending on who was telling the story. Vanessa didn't know that. She assumed, as she always had, that I'd absorb the discomfort until it went away. That I'd eventually step in, explain myself, restore balance. The idea that I might not play that role anymore didn't seem to occur to her. On Sunday evening, after the twins were asleep and the house was finally quiet, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my bag. The envelope slid out easily. I ran my thumb along the edge, then tucked it back in without opening it. I didn't need to read it to know what it represented. Vanessa was still talking, still adjusting the story to fit her needs, still confident that if she spoke first, and often enough, the truth wouldn't matter. I didn't feel angry about it. I felt prepared. For once, I wasn't reacting to her version of events. I was letting it unfold, knowing exactly where it would run into something it couldn't move around. I felt it the second I walked into the house, the shift in the room that told you people had already been talking before you arrived. Conversations dipped slightly, then resumed. Heads turned. Smiles appeared a beat too late. The kind of politeness that isn't meant to welcome, just to observe. My grandfather's living room looked the same as it always had. Clean lines, neutral colors, everything in its place. The consistency of it grounded me. I adjusted my grip on my bag, aware of its weight, without needing to think about what was inside. Vanessa spotted me almost immediately. She crossed the room with practiced ease, her expression soft with concern, the version of herself she liked witnesses to see. "There you are," she said, reaching for my arm like we were close. "Everyone's been asking about you." I stepped just enough to the side that her hand missed. Not dramatic, just clear. "I'm here," I said. Her smile tightened. "We were worried you wouldn't come." "I said I would," I replied. She laughed lightly, the sound pitched just high enough to carry. "You know how you've been lately. We didn't want to overwhelm you." I didn't respond. There was nothing to add. My parents stood near the fireplace, watching. My mother's eyes flicked between me and Vanessa, already braced. My father's jaw was set the way it always was when he thought control was slipping. I didn't greet them right away. I went to my grandfather instead. He nodded when he saw me calm and steady, like this was just another evening he'd prepared for. "Glad you came," he said. "So am I," I replied. He gestured for everyone's attention a few minutes later, lifting his glass slightly. The room quieted without effort. That was the thing about him. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. "I want to thank everyone for being here," he said. "I don't host often anymore, so when I do, it's usually because there's something worth discussing." A ripple of polite laughter moved through the room. Vanessa smiled brightly. My mother relaxed just a fraction. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," he continued. "About family, about patterns, about what we assume versus what's actually happening." The laughter faded. Vanessa shifted her weight. My father crossed his arms. "I've also been reviewing some information that was brought to my attention recently." My grandfather said, "Information that challenges some of the stories being told." Vanessa's smile faltered. Before we go any further, my father said quickly, stepping forward, I think it's important to remember that Evelyn's been under a lot of stress. She's been through a medical scare, and emotions have been high. My grandfather turned his head slightly. Richard, you'll have a chance to speak. Sit down. The room went very still. My father hesitated, then complied. My grandfather looked around the room once more before continuing. I'm not here to assign blame or provoke conflict. I'm here to clarify fact. He reached into the folder resting on the table beside him and pulled out a stack of papers. Vanessa's eyes locked onto them. For years, he said this family has operated under the belief that support flowed where it was needed most, that assumptions were fair, that contributions were balanced. He held up the first page. They were not. A murmur ran through the room. These are financial records, he continued, his voice even. They document consistent long-term support provided by one family member to others. Vanessa let out a small laugh. I'm sure there's an explanation, Vanessa, my grandfather said without raising his voice. Please? He turned the page. Over the past 8 years, Evelyn has paid the mortgage on her parents' home. Monthly, without interruption. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. That's not my father started. Let me finish, my grandfather said. He read out the numbers calmly. No emphasis, no judgment, just facts. Insurance premiums, maintenance costs, emergency expenses. Transfers timed precisely around moments of instability. Patterns that couldn't be explained away. By the time he reached the total, the room had gone silent. That amount, he said, exceeds $300,000. Someone gasped. An aunt near the window shook her head slowly. Vanessa stared at the papers like they were written in another language. That can't be right, she said. She would have said something. She did, my grandfather replied. By continuing to send the money. My father stood up abruptly. This isn't fair. She offered to help. I'm not disputing that, my grandfather said. I'm disputing what happened next. He lifted his phone and adjusted his glasses. 2 weeks ago, he said Evelyn was taken to the hospital with internal bleeding. She required emergency surgery. My mother inhaled sharply. From the ambulance, he continued, she contacted her sister, asking for temporary help with her children. Vanessa's face drained of color. I'm going to read the response she received, my grandfather said. Verbatim. He read the text message out loud, every word. No one moved. Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked around the room, searching for someone to interrupt, to reinterpret, to save her. No one did. That message, my grandfather said, lowering his phone, was sent while Evelyn was being rushed into surgery. My father sank back into his chair. This family has been comfortable calling Evelyn strong, my grandfather continued, using that word as justification for taking from her without checking in, for dismissing her needs, for prioritizing others. He looked directly at Vanessa. Strength is not permission. Vanessa shook her head, voice barely audible. I didn't know about the money. You didn't ask, he replied. My mother started crying quietly, not the performative kind, but the kind that comes when the narrative finally collapses. I'm not asking anyone here to choose sides, my grandfather said, addressing the room. I'm asking you to see what's been happening. He turned to me then. Evelyn, would you like to say anything? I hadn't planned to speak. I hadn't needed to. The facts were doing the work. But I stepped forward anyway. I didn't come here to embarrass anyone, I said. My voice didn't shake. I came because I was invited. I looked at Vanessa, then my parents. For a long time, I thought being dependable was the same as being valued. I continued. I was wrong. No one interrupted. I've stopped sending money, I said. Not as punishment, as a boundary. Vanessa swallowed hard. You can't just, I said. And I have. The room stayed quiet, heavy with realization rather than outrage. No shouting, no chaos. Just the sound of a story finally reaching the part where it couldn't pretend anymore. I stepped back to my grandfather's side. Nothing exploded. No one stormed out. No dramatic confrontation followed. What happened instead was harder to ignore. People started looking at each other differently. And that shift didn't need any more explanation. The air outside felt cooler than it should have, like the house behind me had been holding its breath and finally let it out. I stood on the walkway for a moment, adjusting the strap of my bag on my shoulder, listening to the muffled sounds of people still talking inside. Not arguing, processing. That difference mattered. My grandfather stepped out beside me and closed the door gently, as if volume could undo what had already been said. "You okay?" he asked. I said, and this time there was no hesitation. He studied my face, then nodded. "Good." We walked to our cars without rushing. The driveway lights cast long shadows across the pavement. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. Life apparently was continuing on schedule. "Call me when you're home," he said. "I will." He didn't offer advice. He didn't warn me about fallout. He didn't tell me to be patient or forgiving. He knew better. He'd seen enough families fracture and reform to understand that clarity did its own work. The drive home was quiet. No radio, no phone calls. I rolled the window down just enough to feel the air on my face, grounding myself in the present, instead of replaying the room I'd left behind. When I got home, the lights were on in the living room. The sitter was packing up her bag while Lily and Lucas sat on the floor building something crooked and proud out of blocks. "Mom," Lily said, spotting me immediately. I knelt carefully, letting them climb into my arms, one at a time. Their weight was familiar, solid, real. "All good?" the sitter asked. "All good," I said. After she left the house, settled into its own rhythm. Bath time, pajamas, stories read at a reasonable volume because my side still needed consideration. When the twins were finally asleep, I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them breathe the rise and fall of their chests, steady and unconcerned. That steadiness felt earned. My phone buzzed once while I was in the kitchen. A text from an aunt I rarely heard from. "I didn't know. I'm sorry." Another followed from a cousin. "That must have been hard. If you need anything, let me know." I read them, acknowledged them with short replies, and set the phone down. There was no satisfaction in the messages, just confirmation that the truth had landed where it needed to. The calls I didn't get were louder. Vanessa didn't reach out that night. Neither did my parents. I imagined them sitting with the reality they'd avoided for years, each of them reacting in their own way. My mother likely crying. My father likely retreating into silence. Vanessa replaying the moment she froze, searching for a way to reframe it. I didn't feel responsible for any of that. The next few weeks were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful exactly, but uncluttered. Without the automatic transfers draining out on fixed dates. My finances felt lighter, more flexible. I set up a college fund for the twins and scheduled regular contributions. Watching that balance grow felt different than watching money disappear into other people's needs. At work, my recovery wrapped up on schedule. I eased back into duty, following the same rules I'd always respected. No shortcuts, no proving points. My command welcomed me back without commentary assigning responsibilities based on capacity, not assumptions. It was a relief not to be exceptional, just competent. My parents tried to call once from a number I recognized. I let it go to voicemail. My mother's voice sounded small, asking if we could just talk things through. I listened once, then deleted it. Talking things through had never meant change before. It meant smoothing over, resetting, pretending. I wasn't interested in that anymore. Vanessa's attempt came later, a text that read like a negotiation. "I didn't know everything. We should clear the air." I stared at it for a moment, then typed a reply I kept simple and honest. "I'm not available for that right now. Please respect that." She didn't respond. Weeks turned into months. The family gatherings I skipped happened without comment. Invitations slowed, then stopped. Some relatives stayed in touch. Others drifted. That sorting felt natural, not punitive. My grandfather remained constant. Sunday afternoons with the twins became a routine. He took them to the park, let them ask too many questions, taught them card games they barely understood. Watching him with them filled a space I hadn't realized was empty. One afternoon, while Lily and Lucas chased each other across the grass, he sat beside me on a bench. "You know," he said, "families don't end when boundaries go up. They just change shape." "I know," I said. And sometimes he added, "The new shape is healthier." I believed him. I didn't become bitter. That surprised people who expected some kind of hard turn. The truth was, bitterness required more energy than I was willing to spend. I had kids to raise, a career to continue, a life that finally felt aligned with what I actually valued. Strength, I'd learned, wasn't about absorbing everything quietly. It was about choosing what you carried, One evening after the twins were asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and updated my emergency contacts again. Not because anything was wrong, but because things had changed. I added my grandfather. I added a close friend from base. People who had shown repeatedly that they understood responsibility without entitlement. That list felt right. I didn't cut my family out of my life with a dramatic announcement. I just stopped arranging my life around their expectations. When communication happened, it happened on terms that respected my boundaries. When it didn't, I didn't chase it. The house stayed calm. The kids laughed easily. I slept better. If someone asked me now whether I regretted how things unfolded, I wouldn't know how to answer that. Regret implies an alternative. I wanted more. I couldn't imagine going back to the version of myself who thought being dependable meant being depleted. I was still dependable, just not at my own expense. On a quiet night, weeks later, I stood at the sink, washing dishes, listening to the low hum of the dishwasher, and the steady rhythm of a life that no longer felt like it was waiting for permission. The choices I'd made weren't loud. They weren't dramatic. They were solid. And for the first time, that solidity belonged to me. For a long time, I thought family meant endurance, that if I stayed quiet, stayed useful, stayed strong, things would eventually balance out. What I learned instead is that silence doesn't create peace. It just hides imbalance. This wasn't a loud family revenge story, and it wasn't about punishment. It was about telling the truth, setting boundaries, and choosing a life that doesn't require constant self-sacrifice to earn love. Family drama has a way of revealing who shows up when it matters, and who only benefits when you do. If this family revenge story resonated with you, and you want more real stories about boundaries, truth, and standing your ground, make sure you subscribe to the channel. New stories like this are coming, and I'd really like you to be here for them.